Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the archaeologist, now let's get into the travels.
Welcome to Prague. You might think of Prague as one of the party centers of the world, and don't get me wrong, it definitely is. But what do you do in between the partying? What happened to make Prague so multicultural? What happened to make Prague the city it is today? Well, that's what we're going to look at right now.
Now, Prague is in the unique situation of being one of the few cities I visited twice. Once in 2018, 5 years ago, before COVID hit, and once just this June in 2023. It really was like visiting two separate cities, especially going under two separate circumstances 5 years apart. Now, the first time I went with my aunt and uncle, who were there to film this truly dizzying activity I partook in, and the second time I went with friends who helped me film some of this video, so thanks guys. And I'll tell you this, Prague is definitely a place you want to visit with your friends. Prague is definitely a party city, and fortunately it's easy to get around. With trams and underground cross-country trains and buses, plus a few other modes of transport, there's really no reason to need a cab or to drive anywhere unless you plan to spend a lot of time in the countryside. And it's easy to stay drunk, too.
Alright, so one thing to note about Prague is that the water is not free and the prices are unpredictable, with water often not being listed on the menu. Fortunately, most of the tap water is drinkable, but this, £5. Seriously. Now, I would recommend bringing a water bottle and filling up at your hotel. And I would also recommend budgeting for it.
Prague is in the geographic center of Europe, and in many ways the historical center of Europe as well. It sits on the Vltava River, which is a tributary of the Danube. Not that I really noticed it my first time around, I was far too dizzy.
Because Prague was the center of Europe, home to so many empires, you can see just about any kind of architecture in this city, from Cold War to Habsburg to medieval. If you want to see a mix of all history, Prague is definitely one of the cities to come to.
Now, when you do visit, you can see all of these pieces of history in one place, that of course being the museum. In between the parties and the subsequent hangovers, this museum is well worth a visit, as it will give you a taste of Czech history, science, and even some paleontology. Now, there's a lot to discuss in Prague, so much so that I'm going to be releasing more than one video on it, and I want to show you just a few highlights of Prague and take you through some of the hidden archaeological treasures you can find. So following the collapse of the Avar Khanate, Prague was settled by the Czechs, a Western Slavic people similar to the Poles and the Slovaks. The city of Prague sprang up around the castle, which was established around the year 870 by the Prince Bořivoj. Now, Bořivoj was the first historically attested prince of the Czechs, and he named the city Praha after the Czech word for prach, which can mean either threshold in connection with the prophetess who told Bořivoj to build his castle here, where a man was hewing a door for his house. However, it could also mean rapid or ford in reference to the Vltava River.
So right now I'm standing in the middle of Prague Castle, and Prague Castle was initially built in 880. And it was around this castle that Prague itself was founded. Now, probably the most famous figure from this castle is King Wenceslas from the founding days of Prague. And Wenceslas is known both from the Christmas Carol and as the man who essentially Christianized the Bohemian kingdom.
Despite the fact Wenceslas was a grandson of Bořivoj, he is considered one of the fathers of the Czechs and the founder of Bohemia. And his real name was actually Svatý Václav, and I know it doesn't sound like it, but Wenceslas is the Latin version of this name.
Wenceslas was assassinated in 935 by his brother Boleslav I because he was trying to take them close to the Saxons. But in this, Boleslav failed, because the Bohemians gradually drew close to the Saxons anyway, and by the year 1000, when the Saxons were Holy Roman Emperors themselves, Bohemia joined them in the empire and became one of the chief prince-electors.
Wenceslas is buried here in the Church of St. Vitus, which today forms the center of the castle. The castle was expanded by various dynasties and kings until it reached its relatively current form around the 18th century. However, some of the oldest foundations can still be seen. This is the oldest section of the castle, dating to around the 930s, where Wenceslas's tomb is located. The first aspects of the city naturally sprang up around the castle, however, a significant lower-class agglomeration sprang up immediately opposite the river as well. This led to the construction of a bridge, and at the time it was built, it was the longest in Europe. This was the famous Charles Bridge, but despite the name, it wasn't built by the Emperor Charles. However, Charles was incredibly important to the history of Prague. Despite being a Slavic nation, Bohemia very quickly became a German kingdom as a prince-elector of the Holy Roman Empire. It became central to the empire's politics, with Prague itself even acting as the capital for a few years in the 16th century. However, it was during the reign of the Emperor Charles IV that Prague truly expanded as an imperial city. Charles was a member of the Luxembourg dynasty, and yes, despite this name, he actually was born in Prague, and the dynasty used to rule from Prague. But despite this, he did have a lot of his childhood in France and Germany proper, as well as in, of course, Luxembourg. Now, his education in German and French eventually led him to be named King of the Romans, and then in 1355 he made the journey down to Rome to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Now, what was the difference between these two titles? Essentially, the King of the Romans was named the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire by the Germans, whereas the Holy Roman Emperor was something proclaimed only by the Pope. It's a complicated political situation that's not really the subject of this video. Charles IV is ubiquitous in Prague, however. The Charles Bridge is named for him. The statues were added during the 18th century, but it's called the Charles Bridge because he built the current structure, replacing the old bridge, and he was just so important to Prague's history. He did more than just improve the bridge that bears his name. He took Prague from a Dark Age Slavic capital to a medieval imperial city, and as a result, very little of the original city outside of the castle survives. Everything that makes Prague a major city can trace its roots back to the reign of Charles, who attempted to turn Prague into a new Jerusalem. He built a lot of new churches, decorated many of the existing ones, and in 1348 he both established the university and built the new town. The new town, established above the old one, is home to a lot of modern Prague's population and numerous historical sites, including the house of Dr. Faust, who you might know from the Faustian Bargain. By the way, there genuinely is nothing there. I would not recommend it for a visit. You can give that one a miss. Prague's oldest brewery, which, based on the architecture, was probably more like a monastery initially, and the Church of the Assumption in St. Charles the Great at Karlov. However, a lot of Charles's work can be found in the center of Prague itself. The Charles Bridge was widened and expanded, however the statues were not added until the late 18th century. You'll see different art styles on these statues, and that's because they were carved by 3 different artists. And if you're an art history fan, it's probably a really fun game to play Match the Styles. See if you can identify the 3 different styles when you're there. Now, I didn't personally play this game, so I can't really tell the 3 styles of art apart, at least not at an initial glance. My friends and I had a bit of fun at the Optical Illusion Museum, though. Signs of medieval life in Prague are visible even in the most unlikely places. I stumbled across these marks in the Church of Our Lady Before Tyne in the Old Town Square. These marks are often attributed to sword, arrow, or dagger sharpening, however may have also acted as medieval remedies with people taking holy residue from churches. In any case, they are found all over Europe. Now you might be wondering, and fairly, why were the guards using the wall to sharpen their swords and their daggers when they could have just gone on break and used a whetstone? Well, honestly, it was probably just boredom, something to do as you're patrolling around the streets of the city. And let's be honest, when you're on guard duty, you kind of want things to be boring because when they're not boring, you've got some real trouble on your hands. A lot of Prague's archaeology is, like many European cities, limited to modern development and covered up by it. Occasionally there is an interesting thing to pop out of it, such as what's being dubbed the world's first gay caveman on Teronska Street. However, when me and my friends stayed in Prague, we stayed right at the end of Teronska Street, and trust me, there's no use trying to find the site. I looked. I was keeping you guys in mind for this. But it's all in the museum, giving you even more of a reason to visit. Hold on. Go back. Yes, I actually did say world's first gay caveman, and honestly that's kind of a bad term, because this was a man buried with all the trappings of a woman. So if anything, this was more of a transgendered caveman, and even that's reading an awful lot into a lot of grave and burial sites and a lot of social norms of the time. But again, any sign of this interesting tidbit is in the museum. There are prehistoric stone monuments around Prague too, if you're willing to take the journey to the outskirts. Alas, I did not. Yeah, when you travel with friends, you have to make some sacrifices, and they wanted to go drinking and see the inner city. Who does that in Prague? Yes, and they made some sacrifices too. I got to drag them out to a bone church in the country. And speaking of the country, there is one thing about the Czech Republic in general that I want to point out, and that is the border. Now take a look at this, the Bohemian Kingdom of Wenceslas. This is the Bohemian Kingdom of Charles IV as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Czechoslovakia, and today. The border has changed very little, especially this western part, making it one of the oldest borders in the world. That's a crazy fact to think about, and crossing it hasn't always been easy. But we'll get to that in a later video. Anyway, there's a lot to talk about on Prague, too much for one video, so I think we'll end it here. We've just discussed Prague's early history as well as some of the archaeological aspects, and we'll do a bit more in the next couple of videos, especially with regards to its religious history, which is very fascinating, as well as some of its later history. We'll also go into the inner city and some of the scientific revolutions that took place there. So all of this we will get to in a later video. Thanks for making it to the end of this one. As usual, here's my sources. We'll continue with the travels next episode, and until then, I've been the Archaeologist.